This tutorial will act as an overview to how the Grasshopper development environment operates, how we can begin to manipulate our parametric model, how we can decompose more complex geometry into simpler geometry, how we can find objects really quickly, and how we can be as creative as possible with the tool. So over the next few weeks you'll be learning from the ground up the fundamentals of algorithmic modeling within the Grasshopper environment, and it's important in some cases that you pace yourself before you are introduced to more complex topics. Generally though, if in any of the tutorial videos that you're about to watch, if a concept or a keyword is unfamiliar to you, just Google it using the Grasshopper 3D site as a reference, or you can always skip ahead and watch smaller chunks of future technical tutorial videos to familiarize yourself with more advanced content. Unfortunately, we can't cover all of these advanced topics in the first week, but I'm going to skim over some of them now to give you an idea of at least where to look and how things work. So I'm going to very quickly create some geometry in Grasshopper. Just to demonstrate how the environment works. So what we have here are some polysurfaces which are stored in this component. So many Grasshopper components, or most Grasshopper components, store some type of data, and some create data. So in this case, this Voronoi component is taking an input. Once it receives that input, it's running the algorithm inside the component, and it's outputting some data which is stored inside the component. Now you can always hover over inputs and outputs to see what type of data is being stored in the component, and there's three ways that this data can be stored. The first way is as a single item. So in a lot of cases you might have just a single thing stored in the component. The second way is as a list, just like this overlaid panel is telling us, which is being stored inside this component. And the third way is as a tree, which is just like a list of lists. So there are different ways of managing how data is stored inside these components. Now we can easily begin to preview what's stored in lists or inside components using a whole set of parameters components which are specific to Grasshopper. So a common one is a panel, which just displays, it lets you input text into things as well, but if you connect it to any output, it'll display what is coming out of that output. So here we have a list of closed breps, which just means polysurfaces, and each polysurface has an index in this list. So we have polysurface 0, polysurface 1, polysurface 2. So this component is containing at once all of these cells which you see here. If we want to work with a single cell, then we can use a whole bunch of components for extracting or manipulating how this data is stored. So for example, if we want to view just closed brep number 0, we might use one of the sets components like list item, and this will be covered in much more detail in the data structures tutorials. So for example, our list item component, rather than containing a whole list, it'll just extract that single brep from this list and let us work with things individually one at a time. Equally so, if we wanted to list one of the other breps which are stored inside this component, in order to display them by themselves, we could use one of the input components for manipulating this item index parameter. So we might use a number slider, which is a tool for inputting numbers to things. which will let us then go and use this slider as a controller for our model. Or we could use a whole bunch of other controllers, like a digit scroller, which lets us scroll whichever digit we like. Or a control knob, which will also let us scroll through things. There's all sorts of components for controlling our parametric model. We also have components for previewing data and working with how the parametric model is operating. Like we can refresh solutions for things, we can graph data, we can load in images, we can cluster entire definitions into single components, we can scribble text on things to leave notes for other people. We can sketch on our canvas. We can double click to find things, which can be really, really quick. And often one way to find a component is to double click and just type in the Rhino command that you're looking for. And Grasshopper is usually clever enough to suggest a whole bunch of similar components. So for example, if we wanted to explode all of our Voronoi cells into individual surfaces, we could, using a Brett components explode, and you can tell that that's what it's going to do just by hovering over it here and seeing its little description of what it does. And then if we wanted to know where this component was in the Grasshopper menu, we could just go through one by one and try and find it. Or if you hold Control and Alt and then click on the component, that will also display where it is in the menu. I'm not going to do it because it also alt tabs out of Grasshopper on my computer. Now when we explode these cells using this component, the third type of data structure besides single items, like we have up here, or a list of items, like we have inside this Voronoi component, is a tree, which is sort of like lists of lists. So this is useful when we want to organize our data in a more specific way. So it's just like when you're referring to people's addresses, their address is typically organized in a way that makes it easy to understand. For example, we might say which country they live in, then which state they live in, then which city they live in, then which suburb they live in, then which street they live on, and finally their address, house number 42. It's exactly the same with Grasshopper. So data trees typically refer to your modeling history. So in this case, we have a tree of objects, which are organized into lists. So we have lists of lists, and each list represents which cell has just been exploded into these surfaces. And just like lists or items in lists have indexes telling you which item they are, trees also have indexes telling us which branch things are on. And this all gets covered again in the data structure tutorials. So what we're essentially doing here is we're applying a principle of decomposing complex geometry into simpler parts. So I started with a polysurface here, and we have a whole bunch of tools for manipulating surface geometry up here in the Surface tab. We've exploded the polysurface geometry into simpler parts, like its individual surfaces, edges, which are lines or curves, and vertices, which are points. And it's generally much easier to work with these simpler objects. So we might go and explode or extract the edges of each individual face in our cells, and suddenly we'll have a wireframe of our geometry, a whole bunch of curves. We might join the curves together. Again, I'm just double clicking and typing in my Rhino command. So then we have curves which outline one by one each face. And then we might even start offsetting, another Rhino command. So we could offset all of these curves by some amount. to create frames. Now components sometimes turn red or orange, and this is because something has gone wrong with the data being inputted into the component. Either we've inputted data which is null, or which is nothing, doesn't exist, or we've inputted the wrong type of object. All sorts of things can make components break like this. A lot of the time they'll output something anyway, but you can check to see exactly what's going wrong by right-clicking on the component and going down to these runtime errors. So in this case, with one of our curves, it just couldn't perform the offset algorithm for whatever reason. So lastly, if you want to take anything that you've done in Grasshopper and set it back into the Rhino interface to render or to print or to continue modeling using traditional modeling techniques, you can right-click on a component and choose Bake, and that'll save it back to the Rhino viewport. Right-clicking on components also lets you turn on and off previews, zoom components or group them, lock things, and search for things. If you want to turn on a preview for multiple components, you can. You just need to select them all at once and then right-click somewhere on the canvas, and this will apply those exact same actions to multiple components. So now you should be familiar enough with the basics of the Grasshopper environment, and you can continue on with the rest of the tutorials.